Let's talk for a minute about impunity, exemption from punishment, freedom from the injurious consequences of an action. That's what it means. Could that apply in this case? I mean, you mentioned your Nuremberg case. The people went to, I mean, they were actually at the end of the day
impunity,
hanged.
Christian, impunity is the rule. I mean, it's not the exception. I mean, we've seen impunity for all the crimes of aggression since 1945, and we've seen impunity for major war crimes and crimes against humanity also since the Second World War. There have been a few persons actually selectively, like during the Vietnam War. You may remember the case of My Lai and the case of Rusty Calley, the lieutenant who was brought to trial and convicted, etc. But that is window dressing. I mean, the people who really were responsible for those crimes were McNamara, General Maxwell Taylor, the big boys. None of those were ever touched. And of course, being realistic, you know that Trump and Theresa May and Emmanuel Macron are not going to find themselves before the International Criminal Court. The same as George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and Tony Blair escaped the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, even though you had here crimes of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity for which they were responsible. So accepting the fact that impunity is the rule, I think it's far more important to shift the attention to prevention of these crimes. That involves the media. That involves getting the information out. That involves educating people. That involves an empowered civil society that will go out on the streets and demonstrate and demand from their governments that they do not commit crimes of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. One way of educating has a pedagogical value, the people's tribunals. During the Vietnam War, we had the Russell Tribunal, at that time launched by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell. And we've had the Lelio Basso Foundation in Rome has also organized people's tribunals. There was also a Kuala Lumpur People's Tribunal on the Iraq War, in which George W. Bush and Tony Blair, etc., were convicted of these crimes. The people's tribunals have no possibility of enforcing their judgments. They cannot arrest these people, and they cannot ensure that they suffer punishment. But again, if you at the very least, destroy their media image, because I am sure that George W. Bush still considers himself a great guy. And Tony Blair, we see it every time he's on television. Again, the shall we say, the arrogance and the vanity of these leaders is amazing. There, thanks to the Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón, at least one criminal, General Augusto Pinochet, had his image as a leader, his image as the person who saved Chile also from this Marxist Salvador Allende. Well, that image that had been cultivated in the press was pretty much destroyed. And the fact that a former head of state could be arrested, detained, subjected to legal proceedings, in the end, the Brits didn't want to have any problem with it, and they sent them off back to Chile. But when Pinochet died, he did not die as the president of Chile, and this honorable general, I mean, his image had been destroyed. And that, if at least we achieved that someone like George W. Bush and Tony Blair lose their image of good guys, I mean, that in itself would be something positive. But going back to the idea of prevention, the main thing is to prevent armed conflict. That is why the United Nations was founded. I mean, we, the peoples, want to save future generations from the scourge of war. That's what we're there for. But Oscar Wilde, back more than 100 years ago, he had so many good aphorisms. He said, as long as war is regarded as wicked, it will always have its fascination. When it is looked upon as vulgar, it will cease to be so popular. And that's part of the problem. We have a fascination with war. You just turn the television on and you have programs on the Second World War, and you have all sorts of, shall we say, glorification of violence. As long as young people are being indoctrinated in that manner, we're not going to get out of the vicious circle. And one thing I also wanted to say with regard to Syria and the alleged use of chemical weapons, because the evidence is so shoddy, is so incomplete. I mean, anyone who has a commitment to the rule of law would demand that first proof, and then we decide how to deal with it. But first, solid proof. And it's secondary. It's this one man in London, this Syrian Observatory of Human Rights. There's the white helmets, etc. Do they have any credibility, really? And we've had some independent journalists like the Irish lady Daniela Ryan, the Brit Robert Fisk, and the Canadian Eva Bartlett.
Vanessa Bailey.
Yeah, they've been really solid reporting, saying that either there was no use of chemical weapons at all, or this was a classical false flag. This was staged. And that actually should be a wake-up call.
Quickly getting back to the Oscar Wilde quote here, I would say today the vulgar is selling. The people are more attracted to the vulgar, you know. And, you know, some British journalist said in an interview, I remember a few years ago, to me, if it bleeds, it leads. So the media is very much attracted to anything that is negative, bloody, and violent. And of course, the movies today, as you said, they contribute to that. You know, the glorification of violence in the media, and most of it comes out of Hollywood, out of America, you know, and goes into all the world. But that's a different subject. Let's go back to the Duma chemical attack, to the supposedly Duma attack. You know, there are numerous videos now, and they show that this whole attack were staged by the white helmets. They found even that boy who confirmed that he acted in the video in return for food. But if this chemical attack really would have happened, launched by either party, it would be a serious violation of human rights. In your opinion, what should the US and international community, or how should they react towards Syria under the circumstances of the UN Charter and international law? Let's say there were a chemical attack, and they prove there was one.
Yes, if there's proof of a chemical attack, then there's proof of a war crime, and even, depending on the scope of it, it could reach the threshold of a crime against humanity. And for that, there is the International Criminal Court that does have jurisdiction. So it is not for the United States, United Kingdom, and France unilaterally to attack Syria by way of retaliation, because that is not foreseen in the Chemical Weapons Convention. And unlike many countries, Syria did destroy its stockpiles of chemical weapons back in 2013, and it was confirmed by the Organization on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that was the case. It's already 2014 that we have that assurance. Now, these allegations that Syria is producing new chemical weapons, we have not seen any proof of that. However, a few weeks back, when the Syrian army retook those parts of eastern Ghouta that were occupied by the al-Nusra and the rebels, they did find a facility that was producing chemical weapons. Now, I read that in numerous alternative media. I did not read it in the BBC or in CNN or in Deutsche Welle, etc. So I asked myself, what's going on? I mean, it's not only an issue of false flag, an issue of fake news, but here an issue of suppression of evidence. I would have imagined that this discovery, which was made public, would have been a game changer, that people would have said, finally we see that the rebels are responsible for the use of chemical weapons. You also may recall the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on Syria, and you may recall Carla Del Ponte. She stated quite clearly that the rebels were using chemical weapons, and that is conveniently forgotten. So the level of manipulation of public opinion has reached really a very uncomfortable level.
Let's get back to the ICC, International Criminal Court, that has jurisdiction over this, and talk about the crime of aggression. Why did they not open a case?
Well, first of all, when the United States participated in the drafting of the Treaty of Rome back in 1998, the United States made sure that Article 5 on the crime of aggression said that the ICC would not have competence to examine the crime of aggression until there was a mutually agreed definition on what the crime of aggression entailed. That, of course, is incredible bad faith, because you have the definition of the crime against peace in the Nuremberg trials. That was Article 6A of the London Agreement of the Statute of the Nuremberg Tribunal. And you have Resolution 3314 of November 1974 of the General Assembly, which is the resolution on the declaration of the crime of aggression, which has a very long definition on aggression. And so you already had, shall we say, two official definitions. And to say that you need a third one is bad faith. But we got the third one. The United States, as you know, claimed to have unsigned the Treaty of Rome. That was Condoleezza Rice back in the year 2002, I believe, before the ICC statute entered into force. And so the United States bailed out and said, you know, we have nothing to do with these ICC. We'll never subject ourselves to the jurisdiction of the ICC. So the United States was no longer a state party and could not exercise the same kind of sabotage within the drafting committee as it had done so in Rome. So in Kampala, at the meeting of states parties, they did adopt a definition on the crime of aggression. It's pretty watered down, but it would fit now. It could very much fit the situation of Syria.
In China, for example, some media coverage said that the coalition airstrikes on April 14th reminded people of the military aggression to Iraq, Libya, and Kosovo. What do you think? Did the military campaign, is that compatible to those mentioned in terms of international laws?
Well, certainly. I mean, they're all violations of international law. It was illegal to attack the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It was illegal to attack Iraq. It was illegal to attack Libya. And, of course, it was illegal, not only this attack on Syria, but the attack last year. The United States also last year sent, 60 Tomahawks against targets in Syria without any approval of the Security Council, etc. A classical violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. But as we just said, there is impunity. Who is going to bring the United States to account? That could only happen if the United States itself, I mean the American people, the congressmen and congresswomen and the senators decide to impeach the president for violating the Constitution of the United States. Because the Constitution of the United States says that international law and treaties that the United States has signed are the law of the land. So by completely breaching numerous international treaties, including the United Nations Charter, the president is acting unconstitutionally. And I think it's an impeachable offense. But again, law is one thing, politics is another. And you may have the strongest case for impeachment, and if you don't have the votes in the Congress, you're not going to impeach.
And like in all these conflicts, with all the confusion and the legal loopholes and so forth, the victims are always the people, not the politicians, not the people that, pull the strings. And I think, this is really, from a humanitarian point of view, the sad, really sad part, that they suffer based on all that. They are the ones, they are the victims, they are dying every day, and they cannot do a thing about it.
That's why I think all this push for international criminal law and expensive international criminal courts in beautiful buildings in The Hague, etc., the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Arusha, and that cost billions of dollars, billions. And long ago, I went public saying that why not have a system of direct assistance to the victims and finance it with all these billions that we have been spending in tribunals that are selective, tribunals that apply international law a la carte, tribunals that pick on the weaker party but will not touch the strong ones. So there is a high level of hypocrisy associated with the complex of impunity. And impunity, don't forget, is always after the fact. You can only punish after a crime has been committed. I always said, let's make sure that the crime is not committed. And in order to prevent crimes of this nature, you have to facilitate dialogue. You have to mediate. And I think it would be appropriate for Antonio Guterres to take the initiative to mediate and to speak with Donald Trump, to speak with Bashar al-Assad, to speak with Emmanuel Macron and Theresa May, etc. This should not be repeated, that you have a unilateral attack on a country, totally disregarding the fact that we do have a system of settlement of disputes, and that there is an obligation to settle disputes peacefully.
Reminds me of some Westerns. Shoot first, then ask the questions.
Yes, well, that reminds me of what I call Wild West international law. It is, again, nothing else than the law of the jungle. There's nothing else than the law of predators. Whoever has the bigger gun or the bigger stick is the one who's going to prevail. Not justice, but just force.
Professor, is there any chance from your point of view in the near future on the horizon for peace in Syria?
I do think so. I never give up my optimism, no matter how much I have seen in my many years as Secretary of the Human Rights Committee, Chief of Petitions, senior lawyer with the United Nations, and as independent expert. I still think that we can make a difference, that we have to persevere, and we have to talk, and talk some more. Now, I am dismayed at the fact that much of what some major thinkers have said and written, take Noam Chomsky. For the last 50 years, Noam Chomsky has been writing things that are crucial to the survival of humanity. Take Professor Francis Boyle in Illinois. Take Professor William Zayas in London. These people are extremely bright and extremely sensible people. But the media does not give them much attention. They can have a conference, they can make a declaration, and maybe some newspaper picks it up. But it's not picked up by the AP, it's not picked up by the Agence France Presse, it's not picked up in Le Monde or in the BBC, etc. Now, I just mentioned Bill Zayas, as a good friend of mine in London. He put out 2 years ago the Cambridge Companion to International Criminal Law, really an important book, a fine book. And I have here the chapter on the human right to peace. As I said, it's not just the idea of punishing through international criminal law, but it's far more important to prevent the crime from being committed. And if you have a recognition of the human right to peace, the right of all peoples to live in peace, and if you educate people in peacemaking, you educate people in empathy, in mediation, I think that will pay off. But once again, there's no money in it. The military-industrial complex has no interest whatever in education for peace, because they fuel wars and they make money through wars. So we are in the vicious circle of a perpetual war situation, in which if you have no enemy, you will invent one. I mean, the world missed out on the great opportunity in 1990, 1991, when the Soviet Union withdrew from Eastern Europe, when Gorbachev unilaterally simply moved out the Soviet army, and then when the Soviet Union was dissolved. This was the moment to dissolve NATO. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved, but NATO continued. And not only did NATO continue, in breach of the agreement that it would not expand eastwards, NATO expanded all the way to Czechoslovakia and Poland and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Now a new member is Montenegro, and you have the expectation of the Ukraine, that one day Ukraine might be also part of NATO, and of even Georgia wants to join NATO. So what do we have here? They still have the Buman, Russia. Russia has done something which is unique in world history. It has actually voluntarily given up power, voluntarily pulled out its armies from countries that were more or less controlled by Moscow. So it's a huge concession, a huge gesture for world peace. And what did we do? We expanded to its very frontier. And notwithstanding the fact that Russia has not been threatening anybody, we have made Russia into the Buman. I mean, no matter where you read an article on Eastern European affairs, you know, the grave danger to world peace is Russia. But actually, I just read that there was an enquete in Germany, and apparently that is not the perception of the majority of Germans. Apparently the majority of Germans consider that the gravest danger to world peace is the United States and not Russia. But again, it's not the sort of thing that you get in the mainstream media. So it's up to civil society to grow up. It's up to civil society to take up its responsibility, because it's in our own interest to maintain the peace.
Nothing new under the sun. Still, war makes money, peace doesn't. That's the problem. Wow. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Professor. You're like a living library. Thank you very much.